All right, I see it's one after. For the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Freight Electrification webinar hosted by NASEO. Today we're here talking about anticipating and preparing for new electricity demand from freight electrification. We've got some great speakers lined up, which I'll get to here in a moment. But if anyone on the line is not familiar with NASEO, I'll keep it brief. But basically, we are a national nonprofit, the only nonprofit association for the governor-designated energy officials from each of the 56 states and territories. This webinar is part of our transportation work. And specifically, it's part of our work around freight electrification, specific to the on-road sector. So within this freight electrification work, we're looking to support states with each of these three pillars, analyzing challenges and understanding the impacts and needs of freight electrification, which is exactly what we're going to do today. We're also helping states understand how they can best leverage the available public dollars as well as private sector investments. And then also working with our state members to build coalitions along key freight corridors across the country. I want to give a quick thank you to our Freight Electrification Advisory Group. All those logos that you see on the screen, these entities make up our advisory group who helps guide NASEO's work in this area, come up with topics for webinars like today's, invite speakers, etc. They're also helping support our direct engagement with states. I'm not going to spend too much time reading all these headlines, but I do like to do these updates on some of the most recent news since our last webinar. Suffice it to say, over the last month, we've seen a lot of news about freight electrification hit the street. Notably, CalSTART updated their market report on zero emission trucks, finding that as of the end of calendar year 2023, over 30,000 zero emission medium heavy duty trucks have been deployed across the US. So a much higher number than I think many of us are used to. Maybe most of us just are used to seeing that electric Amazon Rivian delivery van coming up and down our street, maybe a refuse truck here and there, but there are dramatically increasing numbers of these trucks across the country, which again is what we're talking about today, how to plan for this transition. We've also seen a suite of announcements for charging openings, groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings across the US, certainly most in California, but increasingly elsewhere as well. You can see this Zeem headline in the top right here. They announced that they'll be opening some charging near the port of Newark. So just lots going on, lots to be prepared for, which brings us to our virtual discussion series. We are working to bring you, our state members, more information, kind of hear from the best of the best, the folks in the industry who are doing the research, helping figure out what's to come, as well as how states can best prepare for this transition. We talked about the focus of today's webinar will indeed be on anticipating and preparing for this new electricity demand, specifically from freight electrification. And I mentioned we've got some great speakers here. I'm going to quickly introduce who you'll be hearing from. We're going to start off today hearing from Matt Brucon from NREL. He's a data science researcher there, and we'll share the latest of what he and his team have been up to in terms of what data is available for analyses that you as states or potentially consultants that you work with might be able to leverage to better understand when and where these vehicles will be coming and where charging will be needed. And then we'll hear from Britta Gross, the Director of Transportation with EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. And Britta will share with us a bit about what EPRI's got going on with respect to their EVs to Scale 2030 initiative, a roadmap where they're starting to plot this data out onto a national map. And I won't steal your thunder, Britta, but lots of exciting progress going on there. Then we'll hear from Caitlin Odom, manager with electricity and transportation programs at RMI, who will share a bit about their upcoming Grid Up tool that states may also be able to leverage. And then last but not least, we will hear from Zorai Hagos, Deputy Director at the New York DPS, who will share a bit about what this looks like in practice on the ground for states, how they're tackling this and working with utilities, as well as utility regulators to ensure that states can be prepared for this transition. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. Matt, you should be seeing your first slide now. Go ahead and kick us off.
Thanks, Jesse, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'm excited to share some of our recent work. So my name is Matt Bruchon. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. For those who may not be familiar with NREL, it's one of 17 Department of Energy national labs. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So NREL has an overarching goal of accelerating sustainable energy transitions, including transportation energy. And to accomplish that goal, we partner with communities, tribes, governmental jurisdictions, both state and local, as well as private organizations. Some of this work is around research and planning, but we also do work in the areas of technical assistance and workforce development. Next slide, please. So within the transportation and mobility space, NREL works to accelerate sustainable mobility, including deep decarbonization, but also including equity and that overarching goal, again, of combating climate change. So as far as current focus areas, we're interested in advancing decarbonization for those harder to electrify sectors of transportation. For the sectors that can be electrified, we're focused on enabling technology solutions. So advanced battery technologies, advanced power electronics, and megawatt plus high power charging technologies. And we're also actively focused on assisting with the planning and deployment of a nationwide EV charging network. Next slide, please. So today I'm really excited to share a data set that we just have released publicly. So the goal of this data set is to address uncertainties around medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. And today I'm going to summarize that data set, how we made it and what it contains, but also hoping to really start the wheels turning on potential use cases for this data and how it might assist state level planning. So it's not entirely clear how many medium and heavy duty vehicles can electrify more easily versus how many might face more significant operational challenges. This answer could differ across varieties of vehicle, medium versus heavy duty, local versus regional versus national operating ranges. And the contribution of this public data set is to summarize the typical operations across various types of these vehicles. The data set was created by NREL with support and with technical guidance from the EPA. And alongside the data set itself, we've also released a technical report, which is more of a deep dive into the methods. Next slide, please. So this data set is focused specifically on the medium and heavy duty vehicles that appear to have early electrification potential. And in thinking through that criteria, I think this pyramid on the right-hand side of the slide is useful. So most of these vehicles have some potential to charge at their depot. So the primary domicile location where they park most often. Some vehicles, however, will need some semi-public opportunity charging, as well as potentially some public en route charging when they might just find they have a low state of charge during the middle of the day. The opportunity and en route style of charging would require some form of public infrastructure or shared infrastructure. Also, just is more difficult to coordinate because you need to potentially compete for reservations. So this data set is focused on that easiest to electrify segment of medium and heavy duty, where they have a consistent depot they could use for a substantial amount of charging. So we include in that criteria transit buses, school buses, and 20 categories of truck. But again, the focus being on those that have a depot they operate from. Next slide, please. So I won't go into detail at this moment, but for each of these three categories of vehicle, we conduct 3 modeling steps. The first step, which I'll describe a little more on the next slide, is just to assess how variable operations seem to be across regions. So Once we've sort of assessed at the regional level how consistent or how variable trends seem to be, we down select to a smaller number of representative regions and conduct a more detailed operational model using a mix of public data and NREL models. Once we've built those regional operations models, we aggregate to the nation scale using information on the national vehicle fleet. And those national summaries are what we've released publicly. Next slide, please. So on the regional variability question, this slide is showing a nationwide map of regions that we considered within the truck segment. So we used several public data sets and considered dozens of different variables, but we essentially split regions of the country into different similar clusters. So 2 of these 7 clusters we developed are rural, with short versus long trips on average for trucks. But for urban and suburban regions, we divided those into 5 categories, partially based on business density, but also based on the typical trip distances that are observed for freight trucks operating within those regions. So we get 7 regions. We then select 7 representative areas to do a more detailed analysis of. Next slide, please. So once we re-aggregate results into national summary statistics, we can start learning some interesting things. This slide is just showing some of the outputs that can be made from our public data tables. So this is showing typical vehicle distance traveled, miles per day for each vehicle category. And you can see, school buses and transit buses, as well as these locally oriented trucks, things like door-to-door delivery. These all tend to have relatively shorter operating ranges. So typically less than 200 miles per day, although there are outliers. And this implies that these vehicles, to a large extent, may be able to operate on one single charge without needing midday charging. If you could advance the slide. So this is different for trucks in the regional category or in the long haul, long distance category. So you can see here the distribution of distances is much longer for these vehicles. Some of them might still only need depot charging, but a larger share of these vehicles may need some public infrastructure to charge in the middle of the day. Next slide, please. So we also released summary statistics for average parking time at the depot for each of these vehicle types. And the story is pretty consistent here. So buses, as well as locally oriented trucks, tend to park at the depot for a relatively long time. There's more potential to meet all of their charging needs there, whereas regional and long distance vehicles are parked there for less time. Next slide, please. So we also did release some summary level load curves for each category of vehicle. These load curves have some simplifying assumptions, so they're not as detailed as we would get from a more fine-grained model, but they summarize essentially when charging loads might occur on the average operating day for each of these vehicle types. Next slide, please. So I think what's more interesting maybe than the data itself and the data tables is the range of potential use cases. So again, just to get the wheels turning a little bit, a few example questions that this data could inform. So number 1 would be, how many buses or trucks could rely entirely on charging at their depot, given a set of assumptions for range constraints? Question number 2 would be, if a company or if public investment were to build community chargers for trucks and for delivery vans to use during the middle of their workday, how much of the fleet might want to use those chargers versus how much of the fleet is already totally satisfied with their depot charging? And a third style of question would be about battery sizing. So if we wanted to electrify half of Class 8 tractors, how large would their batteries need to be? And how fast would they need to charge at the depot? So I think there are probably other interesting questions we haven't even thought of yet for this data, but next slide, please. Just wanted to put these links back up on the slide. So I'd be happy to talk with anyone about potential ideas for this data. And the links here are to more information. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate you sharing this. I know it was a lot of great data very quickly, so also appreciate you sharing your contact info. I think we just got one question in. Did any of this research inform what public infrastructure should look like in terms of distribution of charging power levels, future-proofing, etc.?
That is one of the potential use cases that we're thinking through. The most immediate question has been how difficult it would be to electrify vehicles with present day battery sizes. But I think the data could help inform questions of how many level 2 chargers would be enough versus how much DC fast charging versus megawatt plus might you need to support these vehicles.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I'll note as well for our attendees that if you haven't seen it yet, the newest round of funding for the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure National Competitive Grant Program was announced last week. So if you Google CFI FHWA funding, you'll be able to see that. And I think there's a lot of great data that you might be able to leverage that Matt just covered. All right, seeing no additional questions right now, we'll go ahead and move to our next speaker. Britta, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. Great to be here today. Let's just jump in. I've got 10 minutes here to try to give you an overview of EVs to Scale 2030, what we're doing at EPRI. EPRI is basically the research arm of the utility industry. So 3,200 utilities in this country. And we're trying to figure out how to align them better to support customers like state DOTs and DOEs, customers like fleet operators and site developers for charging stations. So here's the only slide I have, a one pager that shows everything that's in the program. And then I'm going to zoom into really one major product that's come out of this right now. It's a very data intensive product that's available to you to use in your efforts, and it's the e-roadmap. But let me just sort of provide some context. About a year ago, we brought together, my background's automotive. We brought together automotive, utilities, fleet operators, charging providers, and said, look, there are some big numbers, big goals set aside for 2030 in the medium and the light duty vehicle and heavy duty markets as well. If we're going to get to those kinds of targets, we've got to figure out what are the barriers to getting to scale. And so we put together this EVs to Scale. It's about addressing all those things that we identified are things that are going to be game stoppers for the utility industry primarily, but also how it affects fleet operators and site developers for transportation. So 3-columned approach. The first column is about getting the data, driving certainty into the market so that you don't have to rely on headlines. Are EVs up? Are EVs down? Are things going well or not? Let's focus on the data. What are the manufacturers of cars and trucks doing? And what are fleet operators really doing and charging providers? What's really happening? Let's get that data. Let's really make it as transparent as possible, because we know regulators need that kind of data. So do utility CEOs, by the way. And a lot of folks are clamoring for this kind of certainty about what should be happening this year, the year after, and so on through 2030 and then beyond. So first column, data, drive certainty, but you only get that by working very directly with the other industries in this transportation electrification environment. Second pillar are the processes that were never designed for transportation. So if you look at a service request process for utilities, they've grown up for 100 years looking at buildings. Buildings take 2 years, 4 years, 20 years for a housing development. Trucks can appear. You can have a fleet of trucks delivered, electric trucks delivered to your depot in 4 to 6 months today. And so it's a very different response time. This is not how the utility industry was set up. It's not that everything can go faster. There are some real reasons based on safety, reliability, resilience of the grid. We have to make sure that stays first and foremost in our mind. But There are some processes that we can tweak, we can streamline to get those times down, so there's a better match between the time it takes to procure cars and trucks and the time it takes to actually make those grid upgrades. The third column is where we really didn't want to just stop with reports on a shelf. What could we turn into tools? Maybe some pilots, but mostly tools. Can we turn what fleet operators, charging providers, the government is doing with the utility industry, can we turn that into tools that are useful and can allow industries to work together at scale so that we don't have an issue and challenges getting to 2030? So in a nutshell, that's it. There are some other work streams in here, like enabling the regulatory environment and making sure that we don't miss out on the opportunities that are going to be significant for equity. But let's go on to the next slide. Let me zoom into really that first column. It's sort of the third column with tools too, but let's really focus on eRoadmap. That is the first major tool out the chute in this program. Again, a usable, useful tool to make transparent what's really happening and when and where the loads are coming. Just focus here on that data section down here. We've been working with the national labs, NREL. You're going to hear from RMI in just a second. We've been working and collaborating with all of the organizations that do above that line, the analytics companies, doing load forecasting and so on to make sure that the assumptions we're choosing are right, the methodology is sound, et cetera. But under the line, this is what changes confidence. It's the data we've pulled together from Amazon and Daimler and Volvo and Enterprise and PACCAR and Tesla, et cetera. This is the part of the program that we're very focused on every single day, drawing more and more major information into the load maps so that regulators and others can really start to depend and count on the accuracy of what we're talking about here. Because up to date, most analysis is just done as it has to be done with simulations and forecasting, because we just don't have, there's no magic database out there. There's no single database you can buy. So we bought everything we could and now start adding all this other information to it. Let me show you what the products look like on the next slide. So here's what it is. If you go to eroadmap.epri.com, I guarantee you about 5 minutes of total joy. Take a look at it, zoom into your neighborhoods or where you work, understand what's going on. This is an interactive map that starts off at a high view, and you can zoom down to what we're calling a feeder level. This is a distribution feeder level. This is a really important distinction in this project, that we could make data so useful that utilities could see where on our feeder system, which is the level of planning and investment utilities do, where on our feeder system are these loads going to start showing up? Not at a state level, not at a national level, but at a feeder level. I'll show you what that looks like in a second too. So here you go. You can dive into the map, and in level, you can take the time bar and move it from what's the incremental load growth we're going to see in 2024, 25, 26, all the way through 2030. And then there's a full electrification button. When every car, bus, and truck we know of on the road today is electric, what does that load look like? So that utilities and others have a real nice planning horizon. You can look at the tool and zoom into an area and say, well, here's what's happening in 2024. Let me see what's happening in 3 years. So I get my solutions right on the grid. If I make an upgrade, I'm doing it in a way that makes sense for what's happening in 3 to 4 to 5 years. And then, well, just for kicks, let me look at what happens when this feeder goes all electric. If every car, bus, and truck some year down the road, I don't know what year that would be, goes electric, what would that load look like? So that we can begin to do a better job of near-term, mid-term, and then, of course, long-term planning. Let me dig in and just show you what it looks like when you're not in the tool. I've just taken some snapshots. So let's just zoom into the Western New York area. We'll go ahead to the next slide, too. This is the Rochester and Tonawanda area. So I grabbed 3 years. I grabbed 2027, 2030, and full electrification. What's going on in Rochester? And the point of the tool is not to be 100% perfect. It's to be able to aggregate as much information in here, knowledge from simulations and forecasts, but also actual data from fleet operators that are already planning deployments of their fleets and so on, and when they're going to go to Tonawanda and electrify their fleet there. The point was to be able to see dots or hexes jump off the map. Like, here's where more load is showing up than in other areas around here. Take a look at that feeder. So now if you just click one click, let's go take a look at what 2027 shows us. There you go. Here's what that hex is showing. So that's a point, that's a feeder level, 0.28 square miles. Feeder level. There's a pop-up that'll tell you how much of that load is due to light duty vehicles and how much is coming from the trucking sector, medium and heavy duty vehicles, which is the focus of today's conversation. You also have a satellite view you can go take a look at. Well, if all of this looks to be pretty much trucking in 2027, who's operating in that area? And you can see Amazon, FedEx, and a couple of companies that I just don't know. They're local, more local than I know of. So, but Amazon and FedEx. So Amazon's data is real in our database, and some of the FedEx data is also real, where we have partial FedEx data. So this is the accuracy of the tool. You can begin to count on this data because you see what's happening. Click again, and we'll see what's going on in the full electrification. I happen to grab a big black dot over there in full electrification. What is this biggest of all loads coming up in full electrification? It's significantly from the medium and heavy duty sector. You see UPS is in this area. Big Lots is in there. A lot of trucking companies are in the area as well. So this gives you this sense that we're getting closer and closer to knowing where and when loads are going to come up and who is actually active in these areas. On the next slide, let's take a look. So now what we've also added in the last month, we're now beginning to add the other side of the equation. That's load. Now, what's available? Capacity on the grid. So not all states require utilities, like investor-owned utilities, to provide hosting capacity maps, but we are starting to collect all of those that do. So what you can see in here is we've got maps, capacity, hosting capacity, what capacity, power capacity is available on the grid in California, and then in a number of the Northeast states. And if you zoom into those, what also pops up at the map is how much capacity is on a feeder line in a particular area. And I will tell you, I kind of grabbed this one Con Ed feeder in this area east of Manhattan. And what I know in that hex is that there's a major logistics provider located in that area who's probably going to be very interested to know what the capacity is on that feeder. So again, our job is to, for the public good, provide information that is useful, can inform decision-making, investment making, and so on. On the next slide, and I'm almost going to be done here. I did want to point out that eRoadmap is already being cited in a number of state proceedings, California, Colorado, and in Pennsylvania, we know it's being used in the background by some NGOs. So it's gaining traction. Folks are understanding the value, pointing out that you may start hearing about eRoadmap, and that's what's going on here in those cases. On the next slide, I really just want to introduce Grid Fast. I don't have time to talk about it here today. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's what states can do. Skip this slide. Here's what states can do to actually help on the EVs to Scale eRoadmap tool. Push data to us. If you can push fleet operators, large loads that you know about, it's very helpful. This is a long time-consuming process. We're at it every single day. If you can help us do that, it's great. I will just point out that the data is, although it's public, it is anonymized and it's secure. We don't advertise who the folks are. We don't share anyone's data, but it's on a very secure website and database that we house here at EPRI. On the second item here, prioritize your grid upgrades by identifying no regrets locations. The idea was to figure out where and when loads are coming so that we all make together good decisions about grid upgrades that are necessary. Remember, grid upgrades usually turn into ratepayer funded types of items. So it's really important to take this seriously. So compare the things that you know of when you're identifying NEVI locations, or you know about your school bus depots, or you know about your ports. Just compare that to what we're gathering in eRoadmap. Some of that data is already coming into eRoadmap, but compare it and know if we're showing something and you're showing something about your NEVI plans, there's a good chance that there's a nice location where some grid upgrades are not are going to be good expenditures of investment early on. And then finally, encourage you all the time to build stronger utility relationships. So if you're doing state-level workshops and you have an opportunity to bring utilities to the table, please do so. It's a large, multifaceted industry, 3,200 utilities of all kinds of makes and models, investor-owned, municipal, and co-ops that are typically rural. Really important that they're part of these conversations, can help you get this early notification going, this lead time. We've got to really sort out the lead time issues that we're finding in this mismatch in transportation. And here's just a quick way of saying, here's Grid Fast. The key is to say that where that design bar, that gray bar right there at the beginning of the arrow is starting, that is usually what happens when a utility first gets notice that a project's coming, housing development or a fleet depot wants to electrify, or Tesla's coming in with a charging hub they want to put in place. It starts with the service request. We are doing everything we can to move that conversation years ahead to something that's, somewhere where it's more a vision, it's an idea, it's a concept. Because if we wait for the service request, everybody's out of time. And then the fleet cars or the vehicles are coming in 4 to 6 months, and the grid needs 2 years to go through all of its mechanics, including regulatory permission to make the investments needed. So the key is to move that lead time notice way over to the left on this slide. And that's all I wanted to show with this. The next one is the cloud. Just imagine GridFast one day being this glue between the utility industry and the fleet operators and site developers for transportation projects. This is what the goal is, to try to drive some standardization also in that cloud to make sure that we can all get our jobs done faster. And with that, I'll just say goodbye and look forward to some questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Britta. Lots of great info again. I know it's not a lot of time, but this was a great introduction. I encourage all the states on the call to go and check out that e-roadmap tool. Just play around in there. I haven't seen any Q&A come through yet, but please type your questions into the Q&A box if you have them, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Otherwise, happy to follow up after the webinar. For the sake of time, though, I'm going to move us into our next presentation from Caitlin with RMI.
Thank you, Jesse. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Caitlin. I'm a manager on our transportation program at RMI, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Grid Up. I'm going to move quickly through these slides because I have a lot, and I think that Britta did a good job setting the stage for the problem. I think most of you are probably familiar with RMI, but if not, these are our sector focuses, our change methods, and our geographies. Specifically related to electrification. My work is focused on infrastructure for electrification. So working across all of these sectors at the top with our industry, mobility, buildings, and electricity team. We can move along. And just to briefly introduce our Grid Up team, these are the folks that are supporting the work I'm going to talk about today. So certainly not just me, even though I am the face you're going to be seeing today. But yeah, let's dive in to the problem here. So as Britta mentioned, I think, a lot of our organizations, including yours, have been looking at what is going to happen if we electrify everything. So our research is showing that we're seeing huge increases in power demand and energy demand coming from industry and transportation, from decarbonization of those sectors. And we wanted to dive into more of what that would look like. So let's move to the next slide. And also on top of that, I think what Britta mentioned and the other folks mentioned, there have been so many corporate commitments, state and federal regulation, and policies and incentives to push EV adoption on all different vehicle segments, and as well as we're reaching cost parity for a lot of these different vehicles. And so what are we going to do about it? So earlier last year, around this time, we released a report called Preventing Electric Gridlock that tried to dive into the size of this problem and what exactly that was going to mean and look like for grid infrastructure. And we also, at the same time, or about a year before, launched an initiative that we lovingly refer to as WeWadi, which stands for What If We Actually Do Electrify Everything? And that's really where my work has been focused on across all of the sectors that RMI looks at. So we can move on here. Yeah, so I think to note all of the constraints that we are trying to prevent, we don't want grid failures to reduce the momentum towards electrification or to, nullify any of the incentives or regulations. We know that there's so much lead time in terms of grid capacity and making sure that we have the grid infrastructure we need. And we also want to make sure that the planning for this new grid infrastructure is not so iterative that it's no longer efficient and leading to much higher costs for ratepayers than it really should. And so we believe, along with EPRI and a lot of other folks, that a proactive approach will really help us prevent some of these major issues. We can move on here, Jesse. Yeah, so this is just pulled from some of our reports using some national grid information, but like the time to construct these pieces of infrastructure is hugely variant, with the transmission interconnection upgrades taking the longest and having the highest cost. So we need to know about those the soonest. And in order to do that, we really need to be able to do sort of mutually a bottom up and a top down analysis here for what we're expecting. Yeah, so like we all said, switching from anticipating where that load's going to be, which is the current process, to something that's more proactive and ensuring that we're providing the information and tools for regulators and all grid planners to feel confident in those large investments that are going to be made and potentially passed off to other ratepayers. So just to dive in a bit to what GridUp is, very similar to a lot of the other tools. We have a lot of tools coming out related to what electrification from transportation looks like, but we all have pretty different methodologies in a way that I think is going to be really additive to adding confidence in what we're expecting from transportation electrification. So we're publishing this tool to predict EV power needs. We're also publishing an investment roadmap that is essentially a guide on how to use this tool or a tool like this to ensure that you're effectively, proactively planning your infrastructure and then leveraging relationships within the WE-WADI vertical of our work. We have lots of different projects going on related to regulatory structures. We have convenings. We recently had a charged event convening that pulled together a lot of stakeholders to come up with new project ideas to help push proactive planning and preparation for electrification and grid infrastructure forward. So this is added to that suite of things that folks can leverage. So we're building on a lot of work that we've already been doing at RMI, some that we got to work with Britta on. So taking the market potential and adoption rates from other pieces of work that we've done and expanding it to a national level. We've done some work on charging corridors for the state of New York with National Grid. We've done specific port level work in LA and Houston to look at what it looks like on a localized level for certain vehicle segments. And then we're expanding that to a national level to understand what are the actual impacts on the grid from probability of charging behavior at a regional and a local level. So yeah, this is just a snapshot of some of the work that we did in LA to look at what the impacts of electrification on the Long Beach port specifically are. And another project that I wanted to mention that we just didn't have the finalized slide for quite yet is in the state of Washington. We deployed essentially exactly what this tool is at the state level. So worked with the Energy Office in Washington to help inform the policies around transportation electrification that they were developing there related to grid infrastructure. So our methodology, is actually some of our outputs are going to be feeding into the tool that Britta just presented on the light duty vehicle side. But overall, we're taking anonymized sample trip data. So we're using Replica as a data source, which takes cell phone information data, anonymizes it, aggregates it to understand what people's travel patterns are like. And then we understand what the charging availability and some probability on what that user's charging preferences might be based on time of stop and type of customer and type of vehicle, et cetera. And then we simulate what the charging behavior would be to understand the energy needs and the power implications. And then we're able to summarize that into load curves and power needs by the census block level. And this is also data we're presenting for light duty, medium, and heavy duty using that same methodology. So yeah, just rounding us off on our timeline, we're publishing this tool at the end of this month. So I don't have a link to send you to quite yet, but I will quite soon. And then we will be working also in Toronto with the Pembina Institute, doing this for a Canadian locality as well. And then we will be also publishing the next iteration of this tool in the winter of next year. So hopefully collecting a lot of feedback from our initial publication as well. So I sped through that really fast because I didn't want anyone to feel crunched. But yeah, happy to answer questions as they arise or any in chat.
Thank you, Caitlin. Really appreciate you giving our audience a sneak peek at this tool. We'll be excited to see it publicly launched here soon. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I think they were initially meant for Britta. So Britta, feel free to jump in quickly too. But I think they likely apply to GridUp as well. One, if you could just share, is it possible to, or will it, when it launches, be possible to download GIS versions of the data from these tools?
I don't know the answer for the e-roadmap tool. I do know that we have intention for you to be able to download the shapefile specifically. I don't know if it will be available at the initial launch, but we're working on setting up APIs and the ability to download. I think, Britta, I don't know if you want to jump in for the answer.
Yeah, I can add, we have to leave something for all the folks funding the program. And so that's where we sort of drawn one very little line in the program. Everything you see publicly on that zoomable interactive map, power data is coming soon with load shapes. That is all available to you, but the downloadable GIS maps are for funders of the program. If you want to join the program, please get in touch with me and we can talk about that too.
Thank you both. And then one more question related to these tools. Are they able to inform non-wire solutions? So things like distributed energy resources, on-site, solar generation, battery storage, et cetera. Those sorts of solutions that might reduce the amount of distribution upgrades needed. Any comments on DERs from either of you and how states might think about utilizing these tools to prioritize deployments of those solutions as well?
Yeah, I can start and then Britta, maybe you can pop in. So for part of what we're publishing are a couple of scenarios, one being managed versus unmanaged, which makes a huge impact on what the overall power and energy demand, not energy, but power demand will be, which is really what impacts the infrastructure here. So things like deploying managed charging programs and the opportunity for that to reduce the overall need for various pieces of infrastructure. But beyond that, our infrastructure roadmap, which I briefly talked about, goes into where it makes sense to be more thoughtful in terms of your consideration of non-wires alternatives versus, really investing in the infrastructure. I think this goes back to being the most efficient and looking at in aggregate where all your customers are going to really just need big upgrades, and it's going to be worthwhile to not necessarily try and build stop gaps with big batteries, which also have a huge monetary and resource impact as well. So we talk a little bit about that in the roadmap that'll be published.
Yeah, I would just say, folks typically go look at non-wire solutions because the utility can't get to the job fast enough and requires a few more years of months or years of planning. This is that whole point about trying to move the lead time back so that utilities can provide the better, maybe more efficient and cost-effective long-term solution. But there are near-term needs that are just not going to be able to be met by every utility in every certain location, especially those that struggle with kind of low voltages on their systems, for example. And so the e-roadmap will certainly help identify that, especially now because you're seeing both load data and wherever we can get hosting capacity information, you're going to be able to see that. So anyone who's in the business of putting in non-wire solutions can take a look at, okay, here's where loads are aggregating in 24, 25, 26, et cetera. And here's where capacity happens to be in some of those areas. Is there any spare capacity on those kinds of feeders near the areas where trucks and cars are doing their activities? And that's the question they can answer. So it definitely feeds much more robust conversations about here might be my future business opportunity. So it's an enabler for action, whether you're in the utility or you're somebody coming up with a non-utility solution.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Caitlin, so much for that presentation. We have another question in the chat, but I'm going to save it until after our last presenter because the nature of it really is about how states can leverage these tools rather than be overwhelmed by them and what you do with this data, more importantly, which I think our next speaker is going to touch on in great detail. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our final speaker, Zarai from the state of New York, to tell us about what he's been working on with his team in terms of utility preparations. Zarai, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. And we can move to the next slide. My name is Zarai Agos. As Jesse mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Markets and Innovation here at the Department of Public Service. We regulate the 6 investor-owned electric utilities and a number of other utilities across the state of New York. And just briefly want to mention our climate policy, which drives a lot of the investments we're making in transportation electrification. On the left-hand side in green, you can see all of the various clean energy targets that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was signed in 2019, established for the state of New York. There's a number of tech-specific targets, but big picture, we're going to be 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emissions by 2040. Adding to the benefits of transportation electrification in New York, it'll be powered by 100% zero emissions electric generation in the coming decades. We also have economy-wide targets, which include 40% reduction in emissions across all sectors, not just electric, and a net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy by 2050. And in order to keep pace with those greenhouse gas emissions targets, we're going to have to keep growing the pace of electrification in the state between now and 2030 by approximately 50% year over year each year. And we expect to have around 3 million vehicles electrified by 2030, in response to the broad policies. We, of course, have enacted the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and have various subsector level targets that I don't have time to get into. At the commission and the utility regulator, we think it's the appropriate role of the utilities to support the charging elements of the electrification transition that's underway in New York. And so that's where most of our programs are focused. If we can move to the next slide, I want to spend just a brief moment highlighting the investments that have already been authorized by the commission. So we've got a very broad EV Make Ready program that's predominantly focused on the light duty sector, just because that part of the market initially was moving faster. A total of $1.2 billion committed through the electric utilities to support the deployment of DC fast charging and level 2 charging, mostly publicly accessible, but there are some lower tier incentives for fleets that make their charging publicly acceptable or for multi-unit dwelling charging. The Make Ready incentives cover basically all the infrastructure from the start of the utility service up to not including the charging station itself. And in addition to those subsidies, the utilities are also provided a number of supportive programs that include a fleet assessment service where they'll look at the service and make an assessment of the capacity to electrify vehicles at a certain location, and also help that customer with evaluating the best rate design that would meet their needs based on the expected charging behavior that they're going to have. I think Britta mentioned something about one of the recommendations which we've adopted here in the state of New York. As of 2020, we've made maps available where you can punch in an address and zoom in and identify a feeder and how much headroom remains on that feeder for any type of electrification, not just EV, but it was really targeted initially for EV developers who might be choosing from different locations to select a fast charging station, for example. We are required to spend at least 35% of the funding and benefits on programming that supports disadvantaged communities. We have a number of programs active in that space that target medium and heavy duty, but I'm going to continue on to the next slide in the interest of time. In addition to providing support for the infrastructure and hardware that needs to be deployed, we've also deployed a number of beneficial rate options and things that help support the operating costs of the transition to electric vehicles. So both for residential and commercial customers, we have specifically designed rates for EV charging. On the residential side, it's time of use rates that provide a discount overnight. And on the commercial side, it's a phasing rate, is what we call it. And it starts at the time of use rate when utilization is really low and demand charges are really hard to bear financially. And as the utilization rate of the station increases, the demand charge begins to be blended in until 25% utilization when the customer transitions back to the regular rate design for all customers. We also offer managed charging programs that provide incentives rather than charges for charging that happens to occur at beneficial times. Those residential, and we have residential managed charging programs. The residential managed charging programs are all operational and live right now. And for the commercial customers, we have them live in Con Edison and Orange and Rockland service territories. The other utilities are still implementing those programs. And again, I'm just going to keep moving really quickly. These are just descriptions of what we're already doing. For all of our programs, yes, we can move to the next slide. For all of our programs, we want to understand the economic impact they're having on the end user. We want to make sure that they're actually going to spur the investment that we hope that they will. And so we look at the impact of those incentives on what we think the economics are for whatever the use case is. In this case, it's charging. So this is just an example of how we took the programs that I described in previous slides and applied them to an economic analysis that sort of determined how useful the programs would be. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at a fast charging station that has low utilization. On the right-hand side, we have a fast charging station that has higher utilization. And assumptions are on the slide, which I'm not going to go through in detail. But basically, the blue bars are the net present value of all the costs over the lifetime of the charging station. And the red line cutting across those blue bars is the net present value of what we expect the revenues or the benefits to be. And so in the case where there's the low utilization on the left-hand side, the bar to the far left is the economics with no incentives, and the bar to the right on the left-hand table is the impact of the incentives. And so you'll see that even with low utilization, the economics really don't pencil in New York right now. So it's really important to actually know that some level of adoption is going to occur in order to make sure the economics pencil. There's only so much we can do with incentives, subsidies for charging infrastructure. And that also translates to the bill impacts of the incentive programs, right? If we're not getting more throughput of electric sales, then the cost of those incentive programs are not going to be offset by any revenues, and it's going to increase the costs for all utility customers who are funding the subsidies. Anyways, we think that the high utilization scenario that's really starting to show up in a lot of the charging stations that are participating in our programs right now. In places where the state just doesn't have good economics for charging, we have special state-driven programs to provide additional subsidies to ensure that we have sort of a good network of charging throughout the state. Everyone has access to the program. But just wanted to provide a window into the level of detail on which we go into for all the programs that we propose through the commission. If we move to the next slide, I think the thing I really want to talk about today is our medium and heavy duty and proactive planning proceeding, which was launched last spring. There's two tracks. One is developing a similarly sized make-ready program for the medium and heavy duty sector. Today, we have about $77 million of funding for the medium and heavy duty make-ready programs, which are pilots. And staff is in the process of developing an at-scale program for the medium and heavy duty sector that zooms into all the specific use cases and focuses and prioritizes disadvantaged communities and communities that are impacted by air pollution. On the right-hand side, we're also separately doing a proactive planning process, developing one. And this, this isn't going to look beyond just medium and heavy duty. We're going to look at all types of electrification, including building electrification. And this is identifying that local granular load forecast, some of the details that Britt and Britta went into during her presentation. Really just building out the process, the framework, how we're going to fund it. And we think this is critical. And I think Britt made some really good points that I'm not going to repeat about just the speed in which that electrification can occur compared to the speed in which we can develop the utility infrastructure. So we really need to be proactive and change the way that we approach planning for this type of load. If we can move to the next slide. We already have a proactive planning framework in place for our climate policies. It's called the coordinated grid planning process in New York. and it combines the bulk transmission planning process that is overseen by the NASEO and under FERC's jurisdiction with the utility planning process for climate, which is under the Public Service Commission's jurisdiction. On the left-hand side, you can kind of see the granularity that the NASEO looks at infrastructure investment. It's the white lines across the state of New York. We have 13 different load zones, and that planning process really looks for congestion that is between those regions and identify transmission solutions to unbottle the congestion when it's beneficial. On the right-hand side, this just happens to be a level of granularity that the current utility planning process looks at. They don't really have modeling techniques that are ready for prime time that go more granular than this right now from a proactive climate perspective. They, of course, have a distribution planning process, but that is a just-in-time, build it once we are certain that the load is going to come. And as we discussed throughout this kind of panel, that's not fast enough for, I think, the speed in which freight electrification and vehicle electrification broadly is going to move. If we can move to the next slide. I think this really lays out, this is a slide that was presented by Con Ed in one of our tech conferences last November, and it lays out 3 steps that I think describe a modeling framework that can be applied for proactive EV investments. And I'd say there are 3 different lenses that are important. I think we focus a lot as an industry on the regulatory framework, that we just need to tell utilities to go through the planning process and describe how it will work, how we'll be funding infrastructure. But there's really, I'm very worried about the modeling piece, because there's some really novel elements. So I think, there's really specific subsets of the modeling framework, like the EV load model that's described in this slide, where, I don't think we have a best practices. I think some of the work that was shared by the earlier presenters are the types of things that we need to harness all of that expertise and funnel it into a modeling framework that goes from that load model to the load flow, power flow analysis that identifies the transmission needs and the distribution needs, and then leads to the development of specific infrastructure projects that we can fund, right? And so I think really applaud NASEO for hosting this webinar, and I'm really excited to work with the colleagues on the panel and some of the participants in this webinar on developing this framework. If we could maybe just go to the last slide, I just, in the interest of time, this is a slide from Con Ed that just shows when you take one of those planning frameworks and apply it to that power flow model, they were able to identify different levels of the system over different time horizons, the types of infrastructure needs that we required, the dollar amounts associated with them. And for New York and many other parts of the country, you'll see that there are some distribution upgrades here, and there's even a transmission upgrade. And as I mentioned earlier, those are 2 different regulatory jurisdictions that oversee those planning processes. And so coordination and having a really solid framework that we can bring to all the kind of relevant jurisdictions is going to be really important. So anyways, we're really excited about the work underway in New York. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Jesse.
Thank you so much, Sarai. Thank you for your leadership in New York. It's really exciting to see how you all are implementing this. I mentioned we did have one last question in the chat about how states can leverage all of the amazing work that each of our presenters is doing. And so I'll just close quickly by noting that NASEO is here to help you do that. We have an open request for interest from states that is closing this Wednesday, June 5th. But if you would like support from NASEO, we have funding to support 2 to 3 states over the next year in helping pool this data, these tools together for your state-specific needs. Please reach out with any questions. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing some additional responses roll in for that RFI over the next couple days. We'll also be hosting additional webinars with respect to freight electrification and how to put some of these tools and data into practice even more. So I've got the link to our website that has more information on this project, resources that are available. It will also have the recordings from past webinars, including this one, once it's processed later this week. So just to say, please reach out, not just to me and to NASEO, but also to the speakers. You saw many of them shared their contact information. They're not creating these tools just to have great shiny tools for webinars like this. They want you to use them, and they want them to be helpful for your state-specific planning needs. So please reach out if I can help connect you to any of our speakers. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you so much for joining, and a huge thank you to our speakers today for taking the time to share this great work that you're doing. We look forward to seeing everyone next time. Have a great week, everyone.